This is Duke University.
I first heard about Farah Jasmine Griffin on this new thing called the internet. I was a grad student in the last stages of writing my dissertation, and to quote the young folk, Professor Griffith's "Who Set You Flowing?" the African-American migration narrative gave me life. But I'd be lying if I also didn't admit that Professor Griffin caught my attention because she was stunning and possessed a name, Farah, that just suggested regality. A natural beauty overshadowed perhaps by the gracefulness, graciousness, and professionalism which she has consistently exhibited throughout her career, attributes that are in short supply in our profession. Easily one of the most important African-Americanists, Americanists, and humanists of the last generation, Farah Jasmine Griffin is the author of several books, including the aforementioned Who Set You Flowing, If You Can't Be Free, Be a Mystery, In Search of Billie Holiday, Clawing at the Limits of Cool, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, and the greatest jazz collaboration ever with Celine Washington, and the recent Hollow Nocturne, Women Artists and Progressive Politics During World War II. Professor Griffin is currently the William B. Radford Professor of English and Comparative Literature and African American Studies at Columbia University. I've been honored to call her colleague, a comrade, and a friend, and I continue to be a fan. Presenting the talk, The Idea of Ancestry, Tradition, Innovation, and Black Freedom Dreams, I present to you Professor Farah Jasmine.
I have been especially struck and inspired by the title of our gathering, both the pre-polling part, but the post-polling part of that title, Black Artfulness and Survival. It has resonated with me throughout the days and months leading to this symposium. And what I share with you today are a series of ruminations and thoughts. They don't come from forthcoming work. They don't come from a larger project. They don't come from something that I have already written. They are sparked by living as a creative person, a critical thinker through this particular time, and allowed to develop through the invitation to come here to be with you today. And for me, it's also allowed me to return to the literary, which is the first love of mine, and that my work sometimes strays from the literary, but not never too far. Perhaps Artfulness and Survival, that second part of the title, is also artfulness as survival. Perhaps that is the secret to our survival in places that need to destroy us, that we have dared to live artfully. We have approached the world artfully with our whole creative capacity, whether it be in our dress, our use of language, our organizing, our music, and our prayer. And here I'm thinking of our in an expansive way. If you hear yourself here, then welcome. In the midst of surveillance, containment, we have not only resisted, we have struggled to survive. And some of us have not been able to do so. But the arts we have produced have insisted upon the importance of our lives, of their meaning. Our art insists on our presence. For it is what art does. Art says, we were here. And our creativity is grounded in tradition. Here, I don't mean the conservative notion of tradition as something that presents itself to us as unchanging and naturalized, but tradition as in that which has come before us, but which is also dynamic, that which informs us, gives us the ground under our feet, lifts us as we reach and strive, that to which we contribute, that which we shape as we engage it. We turn to that notion of tradition for what it teaches us, so that we don't have to reinvent, so that we know what has been bequeathed to us, what we need to create and invent. We turn to it for nourishment, but also to understand what might be better left behind. We need to approach it with curiosity and respect, if not reverence, but certainly with humility, with with sincerity and with integrity. The best artists and intellectuals are keenly attuned to their time. They offer insight and observation. They describe, give language and image to what they see. They bear witness to their moment in time, and they do so fully aware of what has come before them. They care about the past. They look forward to the future. In doing all of these things, they often seem prophetic in terms of foretelling, when in fact, they are actually sensitive, attentive, keenly aware of their time. The kind of attentiveness and the capacity to artfully share what we observe requires a turn inward, requires contemplation, requires quieting of the mind, requires stillness. None of these things are associated with popular notions of blackness. In The Sovereignty of Quiet Beyond Resistance in Black Culture, Kevin Quashie writes that blackness is commonly understood as, quote, expressive, dramatic, and loud. According to Quashie, quote, these qualities reflect the equivalence between resistance and blackness. The resistance is, in fact, the dominant expectations that we have of Black culture. He offers quiet as an alternative metaphor for the full range of one's inner life, and suggests that an aesthetic of quiet, quote, is neither motionless nor without sound, but that is a metaphor for the full range of one's inner life, one's desires, ambitions, hunger, vulnerability, fear, and growth. Now, Quashie is certainly not the first to call our attention to spaces of interiority. In her 2004 collection of essays, The Black Interior, the poet Elizabeth Alexander called our attention to, quote, the Black interior as an inner space in which, quote, Black artists have found selves that go far, far beyond the limited expectations and definitions of what Black is, isn't, or should be. And I would say that it's not only of Black artists who have found that for themselves, but that they have found it and shared that capacity with us. There is a turn in some up-and-coming scholarship to harshly critique the dominance of resistance and the focus on movement and mobility in studies of Black life. And some of that work turns to stillness and interiority. This move is understandable and perhaps necessary, but I would caution us not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. A turn toward the interior, whether it be psychological, spiritual, or inward to communities and institutions that give birth to and seek to nurture us, a turn inward may in fact be an act of preparation of an inner geography, a preparation that may or may not necessarily help to build a resistant self. Certainly, a preparation for building a surviving one. What is the relationship between survival and resistance? Black interiority is a condition of Black survival, and I would argue a condition of Black resistance as well. Think of Toni Cade Bambara's The Street Eaters, which I think of as sacred text in this regard, in that it shows us the high personal and communal cost when the interior is sacrificed during social and political struggle. Artfulness and survival require an element of contemplation, of observation. Think of Linda Brent in The Attic, reading and writing, praying and observing, structuring her future, preparing to make her move. Or Frederick Douglass in The Woods, talking to Sandy out of the earshot of the master, communing with nature and the sails on the Chesapeake, and of course, even though he doesn't quite want to admit it, gathering those roots, the conjure necessary that will strengthen him to confront. Stillness is a mode of resistance. The state certainly seems to think so. Congregating, gathering, standing still is policed now in the ways that it was during the days of enslavement. I want to turn now to a poem that I read over and over, a poem that has fed me throughout the years, a poem that I rarely put on the syllabus, but always end up teaching, a poem that I read aloud to friends and loved ones, and since the rise of social media, a poem that I frequently post and repost on Facebook. Etheridge Knight's The Idea of Ancestry provides an opening for our rumination on the life-giving force of Black creativity. In addition to addressing issues of ancestry, tradition, stillness and interiority, it also provokes other questions. What forms of life are possible in spaces of death? The will to create is a will to life, a will to survive, even as it confronts head-on the abyss of psychic darkness and physical death. Born in Corinth, Mississippi in 1931, Etheridge Knight served in the U.S. Army in Korea from 1947 to 1951. And during that time, he became addicted to heroin, from which he would never fully escape. In 1960, he was arrested for robbery and sentenced to 8 years. He began to write poetry while imprisoned at the Indiana State Prison. He published his first collection of poems from prison in 1968. In prison, he was known for reciting Toast, those long, memorized narrative poems of the vernacular tradition, often rhyme couples exploring street life and using street slang. Toasts are in oral form. They are dynamic. They are rhythmic. Publisher and organizer Ray Dudley Bandler of Broadside Press was impressed with Knight and visited him frequently in prison, convincing him to publish his poetry. He was hailed by the poets of Black art movement, especially Hassan al-Hudi and Sonia Sanchez, to whom they were married. Reflecting on prison and the creation of poetry, Knight told an interviewer, and I'm going to quote this name back before hearing it, he said, quote, "There's some damn good poetry written in prison because prison is an institution that lends itself to reflection. People who are in prison out of necessity become philosophers because they're always trying to answer the question of why me? And how come I'm here?" And also, in a lot of ways, the joint is like a college, institution-wide. The only difference is that college is set up deliberately for reflection and introspection, examination, and in prison, it's just a byproduct. Even though in prison lots of creativity goes on, it is somewhat narrow, and I have thought about the reason for that. When you're involved in the creative process, you become extremely aware. It is like your antennae are up. Now, if you're the lord of a large estate and you're out walking across your fields and become involved in the creative process, you are extremely aware of your environment outside of yourself and inside yourself. So you are aware of the flowers and the meadows and the blue sky. But in prison, if you are involved in the creative process, you are aware of your environment. In prison, you are aware that it is painful. You are aware of the guards in the tower. You are aware of the insanity and the pain and the suffering all around inside you. So you tend to not go through the rituals that take you into the creative process because that awareness of your environment is so painful. People spend most of their time trying to escape that awareness. They do push-ups, play sports, read sex novels and cowboy books, anything to escape awareness in the world. The word awareness appears 11 or 12 times in this phrase. It is the dominant word of this language here. It is a state of being that can bring pleasure and pain, but that also awakens creativity. The opposite of awareness is alienation. According to Knight, prison is about alienation, which he likens to excommunication, both of which he says are anti-art. He says art is getting in touch with yourself. And here he gestures toward art as a mode of self-awareness. Awareness as the ability to perceive, to feel. Awareness as a kind of consciousness, as perception. He notes that, quote, solitary is the nearest thing I can imagine to being in the grave. If you look at the principles or the dynamics of what we call freedom, the main thing that freedom operates from are mobility and communication in the book. I quote him at length here because I think that he actually theorizes his own process, his own aesthetic, his own understanding of what it is he enacts in his poetry. The poem, The Idea of Ancestry, elaborates upon and embodies these ideas. To write a poem is an act of observance, a contemplative, imaginative act. To read it is also a contemplative act, requiring time, attention, and care. And at this time, I'm going to invite you to do something quite old-fashioned with me, to spend some time together in the work of art, to take our time, reading together, to linger, to luxuriate, to indulge ourselves in the practice of reading it closely, to share that moment together. I will give my reading. I invite you to share yours. Join me as we together read, find and make meaning, create a reading one with another. First, I want to read aloud the entire poem. Read with me observing even the look of the poem on the page, the sound of night's language already once removed of him, read through me, to you, and with you. Taped to the wall of my cell are 47 pictures, 47 black faces. My father, mother, grandmothers, one dead, grandfather, both dead, brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, cousins, first and second, nieces and nephews. They stare across the space of me, sprawling on my bunk. I know their dark eyes, they know mine. I know their style, they know mine. I am all of them, they are all of me. I know their dark eyes, they know mine. I know their style, they know me. I am all of them, they are all of me. They are farmers, I am thief. I am me, they are thee. I have at one time or another been in love with my mother, one grandmother, two sisters, two aunts, one went to the asylum, and 5 cousins. I am now in love with a 7-year-old niece. She sends me letters in large block print, and her picture is the only one that smiles at me. I have the same name as one grandfather, 3 cousins, 3 nephews, and 1 uncle. The uncle disappeared when he was 15, just took off and put a freight, they say. He's discussed each year when the family has a reunion. He calls this uneasiness in the plan. He is an empty space. My father's mother, who is 93 and keeps the family Bible with everybody's birthdays and death dates in it, always mentions him. There is no place in the Bible for whereabouts unknown. 2. Each fall, the graves of my grandfathers call me, the brown hills and red gullies of Mississippi send out like their electric messages galvanizing my genes. Last year, like a salmon quitting the ocean, leaping and backing up his birth stream, I hitchhiked my way from LA with 16 cats in my pocket and a monkey on my back. And I almost kicked it with kinfolk. I walked barefoot in my grandmother's backyard. I smelled the old land and the wood. I sipped corn whiskey from fruit jars with the men. I flirted with the women. I had a ball till the caps ran out and my habit came down. That night, I looked at my grandmother and split. My guts were screaming for junk, but I was almost contented. I had almost caught up with me. The next day in Memphis, I cracked the crocus crib for a fix. This year, there is a gray stone wall damming my stream, and when the fallen leaves stir my jeans, I pace myself or flop on my bunk and stare at 47 black spaces across the space. I am all of them. They are all of me. I am me. They are thee. And I have no children to float in the space between us. I'm just curious, how many people know that poem? I know it's called The imprisoned body is here contained by prison walls, the great wall. The free body is also imprisoned by addiction. The first stanza is one of 8 lines that creates the space. It is a physically confined space, the cell, but the imagery creates a larger space through time, through photographs, a visual archive on his wall. They stare across the space at me sprawling on my bunk. He sprawls. I think the choice of the word sprawl is interesting. It is to sit, of course, to lie, but it's also to fall with one's arms and legs spread out in an ungainly way, spread out over, to take up space, to be both expansive and ungainly. To sprawl is to be unruly. They look at him through time, across space, from beyond the grave. He knows them, they know him, he is of them, they are of him. To a more expansive space, to a more expansive sense of time, here we get generations. He is not only an individual, he is all of them. And like Walt Whitman, he contains multitudes. And then there is a shift, sudden shift and dramatic. He is both them and not of them. I am me, he says, they are thee. I know their dark eyes, they know mine. I know their style, they know mine. I am all of them, they are all of me. They are farmers, I am thief. I am me, they are thee. They are farmers who reap and sow. He is a thief who steals what others reap. I am thee, he says. They are thee. Who is the thee here? You were capitalized and we think the thee was God. But is the thee the reader? Is he including us here? Who is thee? And then note the parenthetical phrases. What does he include in the parentheses? The information there seems vital. It seems qualifying. Yet parentheses contain language and set it apart. Stanza 2 is 5 lines. He is not the only one to have separated from the family, not the only one to have left the family. I have at one time or another been in love with my mother, one grandmother, 2 sisters, and 2 aunts, and then one who went to the asylum. Parentheses around the one who went to the asylum, formally mirroring her being taken away, institutionalized, contained. I am now in love with a 7-year-old niece. She sends me letters in large block print, and her picture is the only one that smiles at me. This young niece, a child who writes him and smiles across space at him, sharing in a gesture of warmth, of belonging, but also of writing. She is inviting. She smiles. She is hope. She is possibility. She is warm. And she too reaches across a large gulf in large block letters. In my own parenthetical statement, I'll say something personal here. I see myself in this niece writing and receiving letters from incarcerated loved ones from childhood, many of which contained injunctions and assignments to read, to study, to learn, to pray. Stanza 3 again is 8 lines. Here we have kinship, numbers, and the loss of another one, mobility in the uncle, whose mobility is phrased in a blues phrasing. The uncle disappeared when he was 15, just took off and caught a freight, they say. They say, right? We don't know. He is discussed each year. Though physically gone, he is not forgotten. He is ever present in his absence, in the way that those who die and leave us, or those who are incarcerated, are there but not there, an empty space that is still very present. Absence causes uneasiness, absence interrupts. There is room for birth and death, but no place to contain absence as in disappearance, as in self-distancing. And how do we process whereabouts unknown? The second section of the poem, the first stanza, moves us from his connection to them to his embeddedness in community, in family. And here we again continue the first person autobiographical statement. He is already apart from them. Is his apartness the reason for the conditions that led to his imprisonment? Is his separation from the tribe also a kind of loss of innocence, a gaining of experience? He is in the tradition and separate from it. The dead call him, the graves of his grandfather, the ancestors, and the land of geography, the landscape that their corpses fertilize. How many of them lived long lives? How many of them died gentle deaths? The land of his ancestors called him his genetic calling. Enlightening his encounter to his counter migration from Los Angeles to Mississippi to salmon swimming upstream, he is already forecasting his own death. Salmon make the trek back to their natal place, do so to spawn, to mate, to reproduce themselves, and then to die. And they meet many obstacles along the way, both natural and animal predators. Their arrival in that space is evidence of their having already survived. Reproduction will ensure that survival, and then their death is already forecast. So, death is already haunting this poem. The death of the ancestor, but the death of the protagonist who travels with 16 cats in my pocket and a monkey on my back. His addiction is a calling that competes with that of his ancestors. This line also introduces a new language, a street vernacular, a junkie's vocabulary, a language of a new chosen tribe, which might include miles and trains, lady and bird, but also the beats and burrows. Kinfolks, kinship, are almost enough to challenge the whole addiction, almost but not enough. And here all of the senses are engaged, the feel of the earth, the smell of the wood, the taste of the whiskey. Here he encounters a struggle between the two kinds of sensory and embodied experiences, the pull of the kinfolk and the birthplace, and the pull of addiction. Look finally at the formal change, the introduction here. The introduction of backslashes, punctuation. We no longer have periods. He says, I have almost caught up with myself. I have almost caught up with me, echoing Knight saying, quote, art is coming together with oneself. And it's not so much the drug that prevents him from doing so, but its absence. This is addiction. This is what happens in the absence of the narcotic. The parenthetical statements seem especially important. Movement, vibration up. Mobility is not leading to freedom, right, as he leaves and goes to Memphis. And then I cracked a croaker's crib, almost needing translation. He broke into a drug dealer's home. You get the alliteration, the hard-sounding C's, the crook. Harsh sounds, his agency, his action, told in the language of drug culture. After the chaos, the running together, the hymness in relationship to the people and the land that produced him, and his separation from them, we get a return to the order of the 5-line stanza, once again with slashes without parentheses. And he writes, and one critic writes, quote, this third set of images steeped in the language of the drug subculture polarizes the other two clusters by pointing to the difference between what Knight was and what he had become. As nearness to the forebears gives way to distance from them as he breaks from the Memphis doctor's home, the next day to a more illegal drug or money to buy them. In the poem's final stanza, the great stone wall dams up his stream. The salmon, once again, whose stream is dammed, unable to answer the call of his ancestors. The change of seasons still stirs his genes. He can only move without going anywhere, can only pace his cell and stare across time and space. I am me, they are thee. And he has no children to float in the space in between. But he does have the poem, an act of creation, and out of his truth, both the voice of the individual, but like the uncle, the individual in relation to the group. I am them, they are me, they are thee. By reading this poem, we are called into the idea of ancestry. They are of God, but they are us, connected to him and to each other through this act of creativity, through the poem. And I can't read this poem without thinking of other artists who bear traditions in their bodies and their art. Think with me of Savion Glover, who carries the history of all roofers in his feet, honors them, critiques them, humors them, and then introduces them to hip-hop and hip-hop to them. Or Lauryn Hill singing Black Rage and channeling Nina Simone and Gil Scott-Heron as the gift she gives to a generation currently fighting for our freedom on the streets of Ferguson or in New York or across the world. The resonance of John Carlos and Tommy Smith's Black Power salute at the 1968 Olympics in the gesture of 3 St. Louis football players who entered the field with their hand up. Not the same gesture, not the same sound, but citational and specific to its current time. Tradition, creativity, artfulness, and survival. And yet, I warn us that tradition can also be exploited. Think of the ways our political traditions, our traditions of struggle, have been and are currently being manipulated, commodified, exploited, and sometimes with our own participation. Not too long ago, there were, as President, then candidate Obama was ascending to his presidency, there were a number of pictures going around posted in black barbershops and churches and probably my mother's kitchen of Malcolm seated next to Obama, or in between, Obama seated in between Malcolm and King. Or my application, if we think of the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, an interpretation of our movement in ways that seek to arrest our own existence. So yes, tradition can be exploited. It can be manipulated as well. And yet, to be in this lineage, in the tradition, also lends a profound, dare I say, spiritual depth. To be in this lineage is to call out and challenge moments of its exploitation and corporate causes that do not free us. Tradition teaches us that we are not the first and the only. It teaches us that this thing is always bigger than us, that the freedom for which we fight is a freedom that we may never taste. It is a spirit of survival that emerges as resistance, that emerges as revolution, that returns to the source. It teaches us what we are up against and what they are willing to unleash against us. But it also teaches us that we have nothing to lose but our chains. That courage may come from the most surprising of spaces. That courage is not the absence of fear, but to keep going even in the face of it. To write a poem is contemplative. It is meditative. To read a poem, to contemplate its meaning, to unravel its wordwork, to be closer to that which it is trying to communicate. To communicate our humanity is to work toward our survival. To survive is to resist those forces that seek time and time again to destroy us. The idea of ancestry is the idea of tradition, artistic, familial, religious, political, always in formation, transformative, tending to the ideas of the dead and giving us life in the process. Thank you.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.